What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Film Jump with Jesse and Chris. We're going to be talking about Kong, Skull Island. This was the second entry into the Monsterverse after Godzilla 2014, and the first American King Kong movie since Peter Jackson's 2005 King Kong. Chris, tell me about it.
Yeah, so it dropped in March of 2017, and sort of essentially just serving the purpose of introducing the Monsterverse's version of King Kong, aka Kong. For sort of legal ambiguity reasons, he's just Kong in this franchise. But more or less to introduce that character and set up the eventual crossover, the eventual Godzilla versus Kong concept that they had lined up. Typical portrayals of King Kong are much smaller in the sort of 25 to 30 foot range. They needed to have him more upped to be more of a giant kaiju Toho style monster size to be able to match up with Godzilla. So he's about 100 feet and change in this movie, but they also shake it up in the sense that most King Kong films have been sort of direct remakes of the same kind of concept. Go to the island, find King Kong, bring him back to New York, he gets killed, Beauty killed the Beast, sad story. This was a true sort of reimagining reboot where it's set more in the Vietnam era and is purely an island adventure and is just about encountering Kong and other creatures on Skull Island and sort of telling a unique story in that sense. And so it's the first sort of real reimagining of the character that Hollywood has ever done. So it's unique in that sense and also sort of embedded into this sort of Monsterverse continuity. They don't go too hard in the paint on beating you over the head with the whole shared universe concept, but there are common threads and links and I think it's generally like really effective and a really, really fun time at the movies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My opinion of the movie is that I think it's a mixed bag. I am a huge Godzilla fan. You are too. We're biased in that. But I also love King Kong. I love giant monster movies, kaiju movies, if you will. I really like Peter Jackson's King Kong. There's a lot I would change about that. It's way too long of a movie. Not perfect either. But this one is, how do I say, a positive mixed bag for me. And that I had a lot of fun watching this movie. I rewatch it all the time. But there are some weird, like, inconsistent things throughout this movie. And we'll get into that. That kind of keeps it from being, like, my top three. Like, it's on the bottom for me as far as...
Yeah, it's definitely a fun movie, but it's uneven. It's a little rocky, it's a little uneven, but definitely has a lot of entertainment value.
Yeah.
If not necessarily being a very, like, sort of well-calibrated and even experience of a film. It's a very, very fun movie to watch.
I think they looked at all the criticisms against Godzilla 2014 and we're like, okay, let's inject some more fun and adventure.
And perhaps overcorrected a little too much into the other direction.
Yeah. I like the way this movie starts quite a bit.
In World War II?
Yep, I really like that with the introduction of the John C. Reilly's character, Hank Marlowe, and how he's fighting one of the Japanese pilots, and then they both kind of see Kong, and then we get into our opening credits, and
yeah, and one thing I want to point out that's a fun thing, I don't know if it's intentional or not, about that opening is that it's an American soldier and a Japanese soldier that get sort of locked into combat, and then a third-party monster arises that sort of causes them to kind of settle their differences. Little bit of a metaphor for what may or may not happen in Godzilla vs. Kong in the sense that you have an American monster and a Japanese monster. A greater threat looms that they sort of have to set their differences aside for. Again, don't think it was intentional, but it is a nice touchstone to have.
Yeah. I like where it starts off with John Goodman's Bill Randa.
Mark my words. There'll never be a more screwed up time in Washington.
And their whole journey. I like the introduction of Sam Jackson and Tom Hiddleston's Conrad. Brie Larson is even decent in this movie.
Probably her most tolerable role, I think. And I'm not trying to hate on her. She's also good in Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, but she's not bad in this movie at all. She doesn't really hold it back.
Yeah, and I definitely like all the actors in here. Toby Kebbell,
it's a great
Wingham.
It's a great ensemble cast. A lot of just interesting faces and interesting characters. You could argue a little bit of a too large of an ensemble.
I think
by the time they get to the end, there's 2 or 3 characters that have made it through the whole adventure and you're not even sure what their names are. It's like, why weren't some of these folded into fewer characters and consolidated a little bit? But it is a fun cast of characters for sure.
fast forward, they give all their reasons why they have to go to the island. We don't really care. We just let's get to the island, have our adventure, and you can tell that this movie just wants to do that. They just want to get there and have their.
It wastes no time, and there's nothing wrong with that.
And one of my criticisms about this movie is also one of its strengths in that it has a distinct vision of being in the Vietnam War era and how it has this apocalypse now filter over it. You get amazing shots like the visual of all the helicopters flying in slow-mo and then Kong silhouetted. And it's really striking.
Yeah, that's maybe the best shot of the movie is Kong silhouetted against the sun.
Yeah.
You know, it's on the posters for a reason.
Exactly. But then again, I'm not a huge fan of like the orange, yellow color filter over the entire movie because that's not what it looks like in real life. Yeah. So in that sense, it kind of feels a little disconnected for me. And that there's like a needle drop era song every so often that feels a little like not as well done as some other movies have done, but in that it feels just more like a mainstream movie.
I do have some fun with the needle drops. It was very, Guardians of the Galaxy and Deadpool were very much making the needle drop thing very popular at this time. I kind of dig it because I do just kind of dig that more fun energy that they're bringing to the table. I like it. You can argue whether it's overdone or underdone, but generally I remember thinking like, oh, that's fun because like when I love a movie and there's songs featured in the movie, I do get into the vibe of like, oh, listening to the songs that are in the movie just like I listen to the score from the movie, and it kind of creates that experience. So I like it on that level.
So anyways, they're trekking along through the island, and I'm going to kind of pass over a lot of the details of the plot because this one doesn't really seem so interested. I mean, they're there to try and figure out and map the island through explosives, and it disturbs Kong, and he ends up taking out all the helicopters. I do like the friction between Sam Jackson's character and his men, and that he wants to get revenge on Kong. Because for them, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe the war was over for them for the most part.
Yeah, this is in the period of the time where they're sort of starting to pull out resources from Vietnam.
And so
Sam Jackson's character has a famous line of, "We didn't lose the war, we abandoned it." Mm-hmm. So he's kind of carrying that cross with him through the film of like he feels like he didn't fulfill his mission, so he kind of needs some action to take up. He needs something that he's got to do, and revenge against Kong is kind of what he takes upon himself.
Yeah, and you kind of are along the ride with him at first, and you're like, yeah, he killed all the men, and then eventually it becomes like Apocalypse Now, where okay, he's taken this too far. He becomes a little bit mad, so to speak. Whatever, but you get some really cool visuals. First and foremost, I want to say that the VFX for Kong specifically, and some of the creatures that are in there, the Titans that they'll later be called, really, really well done. And I believe it's because they did the keyframe animation rather than mocap.
Mocap?
Yeah, so
there was a good degree of mocap done on Kong, though.
Right. Yeah. But I'm saying, like, for a lot of it, though, if you go back, and I think there was a lot of keyframe animation with certain things. And
yeah.
But anyways, yeah, because Toby Kebbell's in it, and he
did some facial motion capture for Kong. Yep. Yeah, the design aesthetic, their entire approach on this was this idea of flora fauna, which is, you look at Kong and his fur is almost designed a little bit to look a bit like moss, and a lot of the what they call the instead of the daddy long legs, they call it the mother long legs or the mommy long legs, where it's this giant spider, but the legs look like bamboo stalks, and they sort of even have that sort of texture. So there's sort of these creatures that have this sort of unique biology to them, where they're sort of crossed between plant life and animal life to just give them this kind of otherworldly vibe, this like different train of evolution that they've gone on. And it's a really unique concept for creatures in a movie in general, and I think I love the way they pulled that off.
Yeah, I really liked the distancing they did from prior King Kong movies, how he always fights a T-Rex, and then they introduced the skull crawlers instead.
Yeah, it would have been really hard to kind of top the Kong versus 3 T-Rex or V-Rex battle that they did in the 2005 King Kong movie. The Skullcrawler is sort of stylistically and design-wise, I think one of the early creatures that shows up in the 1933 King Kong movie is this creature that sort of climbs up this cliff face or this cliff's edge, and it is this sort of 2 legs in front with this sort of tail in the back without back hind legs that is clearly, whether on purpose or not, the sort of general design inspiration for the Skullcrawler. So it's linking back to the 1933 film, even in kind of some subtle ways. Mm-hmm. So I love that. But the Skullcrawlers also, there's a lot of originality to them. They just have the creatures from Pitch Black also have this sort of front legs, no back legs kind of look to them as well. And it's just a really cool kind of creature design,
Yeah, overall, I think visually, like VFX wise, the movie is like across the board looks amazing. There are some kind of weird, inconsistent shots in my opinion. For example, when they're all heading towards the island, you get a wide of the ship, and I think there's like a certain number of helicopters on there. They take off, and then as they're flying and they get to the island, you're like, wait a minute, that looks like there's a lot more helicopters now. And it kind of is like, where do these numbers come from?
Yeah, and there's a shot that kind of shows them coming from the back of the ship, like implying that there might be some more loaded back there. But I've heard differing things on whether or not you can tell if it's a consistent number or not. And the director, I believe, swears that it is. But, whatever. We'll leave it at that.
Well, the fact that it feels like it's not is a problem for
me.
Me.
Yeah, maybe you didn't present it well enough if people are all saying the same thing. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I like the overall kind of flow and vibe of this movie. There's a lot of montages in this movie. There's a lot of moments where it breaks down into sort of musical montage, and maybe we didn't need as many as we had, but also you kind of got a sense of with this movie that they were like that there was a mandate of this is going to be under 2 hours with the credits no matter what. Some of the editing feels a little choppy. It feels like you can kind of tell where they kind of were just jumping around a little bit. Not that the movie needed to be longer. I like a nice, brisk, fast-paced monster movie especially, but for the size of the cast, it feels like maybe there's a little bit more meat on the bones that was cut just to keep the pace up. It feels like maybe they started with a movie 10, 20 minutes longer, and they were like, well, we don't, these side characters are getting nixed a little bit. Again, maybe an overcorrection from Godzilla 14, where they're like, we're not doing anything that slows down the pace of this movie. And so at times it feels a little bit edited, a little choppy.
And that's what I mean when I say I think it feels more like a movie rather than a film.
Mm-hmm.
Like, criticisms aside, Godzilla 2014 feels like a film, for better or worse. Like, it feels like the Monsterverse's most sincere attempt at making a film, whereas this one feels like a movie because you have a montage. A
little bit more embracing of the popcorn flick mentality.
Yeah, and the acceptance of certain tropes here and there, and that is okay. I'm not saying that that's a bad thing.
I think it's interesting that the Monsterverse starts with this sort of very film, if you will, type of Godzilla movie, and this very sort of popcorn movie type of Kong movie. And I think as you move to King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong, you see, Legendary, who is producing these films, kind of modulate and hybrid those two kind of extremes, and you kind of get King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong feel like a nice little middle ground of we're threading the needle here, where it's film and it's cinematic and it's kind of legitimate, but it's also got this fun popcorn movie kind of entertaining vibe to it. So, they're experimenting a little bit and letting these movies have their own identity, but then they're also mixing and matching them in a really interesting way.
Some of my issues just come with kind of like the fact that you have a movie about a group of characters and an ensemble that are trekking, going on an adventure. You kind of lose a little bit of the character depth. They are fun and they all have dialogue and they all communicate. They're all given plenty to do, but they do feel one-dimensional in that regard. I don't really care about all these characters, so to speak. So when they do get killed off, I don't really care, even though and that's like a fundamental part of the adventure style movie that it's trying to be, I think.
Yeah, and that's a little bit, like, I would kind of argue, like, the ensemble's a little too big, in that if some of these characters had been folded together, then some of that material and some of that connection to some of them would have been a little stronger when some of them are getting picked off. Because I love the whole picking off the cast and whittling the cast down kind of movies. I love creature features like that. Mm-hmm. But when you get to the end of the movie and you've got 2 or 3 that they felt like they should have been picked off or killed off, then maybe their material should have been folded into some of these other characters that did get picked off, so that you get down to your sort of 3 or 4 survivors at the end instead of 6 or 7 survivors at the end, But that's a bit of a minor criticism, but yeah, it maybe would have been good to kind of hone down that ensemble a little bit.
Some of them, Tom Hiddleston, he's great, but he isn't given a whole lot either. Sam Jackson is good, but he isn't given more than just his I'm going to get revenge against Kong. And
And people have claimed that Goodman kind of gets the Cranston treatment in this movie.
Yeah.
He's brought on further into the film than Cranston is, but it also feels like for an actor like Goodman and a character who seems so substantial, it also feels a little unceremonious in the way he's dispatched.
That's what I was gonna say.
Like it's done a little bit for a gag, but the character feels like it's above being taken out in that way.
Especially in hindsight, with now that we have Monarch, Legacy of Monsters, the series, and you kind of watch that, and they build up his character so much, and now it's even more unceremonious.
Yeah, to kind of get rid of him almost with a joke. Yeah, it's a little odd. They kind of, but the director has talked about how he kind of was intentionally trying to thread this needle of doing moments in the movie, and I'm sure you're going to bring up a specific one, where it's okay if some people find these moments sort of dark and sad and serious, and it's okay if other people laugh out loud at those moments. He wanted to kind of thread this sort of like, is this like darkly comedic or is this like dire? He was intentionally trying to kind of have it both ways in a lot of moments. He talked about that being an intentional thing he was doing.
Yeah, and the scene that you're talking about that I'm going to bring up is the one where Cole, he takes the grenades in an attempt to sacrifice himself to buy time for everybody else against the main Skullcrawler, and he pulls the pins on the grenades, and it doesn't work. He gets whacked against the side of a mountain, and it explodes.
Yeah, and the characters and the music and the characters play it out like it's
serious.
very dramatic. Our close friend Mike laughed out loud at that moment and was like, "It was for nothing." And the director said, he's like, "It's okay if people totally laugh at that moment." He's like, "I kind of want it to be this sort of weird, like he's sacrificing himself, but it's kind of absurd in how much vain he was sacrificing himself for." So again, if that's what he was going for, he kind of nails it, because it's like, you don't know how you feel about it. I don't know if that's the desired effect. If you want your movie to kind of leave people with like, am I supposed to laugh? Am I not supposed to laugh? Am I in on the joke? Am I not? It's tough to have it both ways, but that is this weird sort of tone that this movie has with a lot of moments.
Yeah, but again, I have minor criticisms, but there are a lot of minor criticisms, like when they're in the gas field, or where there's all the bones of the old Kongs.
Yeah.
And the grenades, the gas munitions, they go off, and Tom Hiddleston's character, Conrad, has to go rescue the younger kid who doesn't have a gas mask, and he puts it on. He does this slow motion 300-esque.
Which I visually love that. The sort of the gas mask samurai, as they say.
Yeah, it's very cool visually, and it pops. It's very vibrant. But then he gets to him and takes his gas mask off, and it's just little things like that. I'm like, wait, you're still kind of in the gas.
Yeah, it's one of those kind of movie things where it's like they're clear of the gas when they visually kind of indicate that they're clear of the gas. Some things I do like about this movie is like, I don't think there could be any complaints about monster screen time in this movie. I feel like no one ever says that there's a lack of Kong, that Kong's not introduced fast enough, or that there's not enough Kong action in the movie. They do a really good job of making sure that they keep the monster action and screen time well patterned and paced throughout the film.
That's one thing I think that Kong Skull Island is top tier in as far as Monsterverse action goes, is how visually impressive it is. Just like the whole end when he's fighting the main Skullcrawler, and he gets the propeller from the boat, or the ship rather, and all that stuff. It is so visually impressive. The camera work that they do, and the VFX is so good.
Very well done.
Good.
And the movie knows how to stage the climax to say like, hey, it's final fight time, and we're in fight scene mode. Like, the movie knows how to do that. I love big blockbusters that know how to do that.
Yeah, this one, there's not a whole lot of like big complaints. It's just a lot of minor little criticisms that I have, and that's basically a non-issue for me. If I had to give this like a rating as far as the experience goes when I watch it, it's a solid like 7.5, 8 for me. I am just a huge Godzilla fanboy, so I automatically score Godzilla's higher.
Agreed.
And that's just me. I'm biased in that. I'll admit it. But this one it's a fun time. It's a really fun time. It's a great rewatch,
Yeah, this one, it feels like Godzilla 2014 is sort of aiming a little higher and not quite reaching its ambition. And this one isn't quite aiming as high and kind of lands there.
Right.
So it's like, that sort of, well, this film was trying to be a little more and a little better, and it didn't quite do it, but it's sort of got this higher tier of effort. And this one was kind of more content with just being like a fun popcorn movie, and it does it quite well.
And so,
but it's like sort of not trying to be too much more. So it's a weird kind of vibe. I generally rate it a little lower than Godzilla 2014. They're both kind of mixed bags in that, like, they're both sort of what one does good, the other one does better. What one does better, the other one kind of not. They sort of complement each other in sort of what they do well and what they do not so well. But they're both really solid in their own ways.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it's a subjective thing. What's better, a movie that's aiming to be a 10 out of 10 and only makes it to an 8, or a movie that's aiming to be an 8 out of 10 and makes it to a 7.58 out of 10?
Yeah.
I really like it. I'm a huge fan of all the Monsterverse movies, and for one reason or another, this one isn't my favorite, but I think that's just because I like Godzilla more, and I'm fully admitting that.
And I would say for me personally, I don't know if it's necessarily my favorite sort of King Kong origin movie or King Kong introduction movie, but I think I prefer it to Peter Jackson's King Kong. Again, that's more of a film. This is more of a popcorn movie, but I'm a creature feature kind of a guy. I love a good popcorn movie. Like, I will watch Kong Skull Island more on a random evening than I would Peter Jackson's King Kong.
Right. Plus, maybe spoilers for a review we're going to do in the future, but you always have Godzilla versus Kong. You get the best of both worlds in that. So
100%.
We'll get there. So yeah, let us know what you think about Kong Skull Island. We're doing this Monsterverse review. The second one was Kong Skull Island before King of the Monsters came out. It's a good time. I like it a lot.
And another thing I really love about it, probably my personal favorite post-credit scene of any movie ever, just because of the timing of where it was in the course of the Monsterverse and the developing of it. We get a great post-credit sequence that is setting up Godzilla King of the Monsters in some ways, but just really setting up long-term that Godzilla and Kong are going to be in a movie together. And in 2017, seeing that post-credit scene, it was awesome.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for stopping by.
Have a good one.